Okay, now for part 2. So we're going to pick up with the benefits of marriage, and so you might see some of them as benefits, you might see some of them as consequences, but they are what happens. They are what marriage means, what it does for the people that are in the marriage. And the first thing is that most states, all states, allow for full faith and credit. So that means if you get married in Indiana and you move to Kentucky, you are married in Kentucky. I think we talked a little bit about it in terms of common law marriage, but the only exception to that is if it's against public policy. So before Obergefell, if you could get married in Connecticut and it was a legal marriage to get married to someone of the same gender in Connecticut, you could move to Alabama and Alabama would refuse you full faith and credit and not recognize that Connecticut valid marriage because it was against Alabama public policy. The issue where this may become an issue is with polygamous marriages. You talked about Cody Brown. The Cody Brown was in your textbook. Again, trash TV. Sister Wives is the show that he was on, and there were some criminal consequences to his polygamous marriage. But legally speaking, those criminal consequences were because of the living arrangement, not because of the marriage. Because if you watched Sister Wives at all, which you know I did, he was only ever legally married to one at a time, and he had 4 wives, and one was the legal wife and none of the others were married to him. And at some point during the series, he had to divorce that wife and marry another one of his wives for I think insurance or child custody purposes. I can't remember which one, but the law didn't like that either, and so they moved from Utah to Nevada because the Utah laws made the polygamous relationship itself illegal. And there's more detail in your textbook on that. But let's say Nevada allowed polygamous marriage, and you could move to Nevada and you could marry 4 different people at the same time, and that was legal. Utah could easily say, well, that's against public policy, so we're not going to allow that full faith and credit. But I'm hard pressed to come up with other examples of where that may be an issue. Typically, if you get married in one state, you are married for purposes of another state's law if you decide to move there. Okay. Some of the other benefits to marriage. Are the laws governing property ownership. Now, here's where it gets dicey, because sometimes it's a help and sometimes it's not, as you will see in your discussion board for this week. So the discussion board that I posted this week has an example where property ownership might be beneficial. Joint property ownership may be beneficial, it may be not. But one of the basic benefits is that you can accrue property together. Sometimes in some states you don't need paperwork to do that, and you're living together, so just by nature of that you can save on expenses by living together in one house. The other issues dealing with property have to do with taxes. So married people can get different tax breaks or tax incentives. And you can have a spouse be a dependent on your taxes because of one of the other benefits of marriage. One of the other consequences of marriage is the duty to support each other and children from your marriage. And this is a financial duty. So when you get married, you agree to financially support the other person. These two concepts go hand in hand, because if I have the duty to support you, then my property is your property. Now, it's not that way in every state, and we're going to talk about the differences between the two forms of property ownership in a second. But they really go together, because if I'm married to someone and I lose my job, or I become disabled and I cannot take care of myself, my spouse has the financial duty to support me. This has massive consequence to your credit score, to debt you may accrue, to getting rid of property, to adding property. Sometimes with property you might inherit during a marriage, or debt you might accrue. So the consequences to this are vast. And this is why prenups happen, because we want to avoid or contract some of these duties away, whether they are property ownership duties or whether they are the duty to support. All right. There are some public benefits to getting married. I've already talked about the tax consequences. Your tax deductions might be different. Your tax married filing jointly or married filing separately might have a different deduction, and that changes significantly. But filing head of household, there are different financial consequences, not just in private property ownership, but in the benefits that we receive publicly. Some of those consequences are good, and some of those consequences are bad. Let's assume that an elderly couple who is retired, we have an able-bodied husband and a disabled wife. There have been recent reports in the media of people like that having to be divorced and live separately from each other because the wife could not get Medicare benefits, Medicaid, Medicare benefits, could not get those public benefits because her husband's ability and income were taken into consideration, and that husband was on a fixed, let's say a pension, couldn't afford the care the wife needed. So sometimes those public benefits are a benefit, and sometimes they can be a detriment depending on your individual situation. So those potential legal consequences are significant. Then your book does not list another common consequence. And that is the concept of legal agency. Very often. So agency laws, you would have talked about this in contracts or property. Agency laws are when you have the right to act on someone else's behalf as their agents. Very often, the law is set up in a state so that you can do that for your spouse, but you have to be legally married to do so. This can be a benefit and a detriment as well. For instance, and this sometimes is based on law, and it's sometimes based on a policy of a private organization. But let's say you and your fiance go to the hospital because your fiance is having a heart attack. Your fiance goes under anesthesia for a procedure, and while they're under anesthesia, the doctor wants to make some sort of call as to what happens. Very often, if you are not legally married to that person, you cannot consent for them because you're not the agency. So what happens? Well, they call their parents if they can find them, even with adults. I've known this personally to happen. But if you're not the legal agent, then you can't consent for them for medical procedures. Now, whether or not that's legal, a lot of what happens in family law, I will say this multiple times, just because the law allows it does not mean the police will help you with it, does not mean a hospital will help you with it, does not mean you will win in court. There are lots of different shades of gray in this argument, and this is one of them. Is an adult's parent their legal agent? Probably not, but a hospital is unlikely to allow you to consent for surgery for that person if they are not your spouse. If you are their spouse, then the law does protect that relationship because we might allow legal agency under most state laws for purposes of medical decisions. And so that's a significant decision that is not dwelled upon in your textbook, but it really is. And then you already know one of the consequences of marriage is a presumption of paternity. We talked about that last week. If you are married to her, you are the father of her child, unless and until a biological test determines otherwise. That's a presumption of parentage that we talked about, presumption of paternity, in the last lecture. So that's another one as well. Okay, so the last thing that we need to talk about in this lecture, that is the substantive portion without talking about the cases, is property ownership. Now, I found that this portion was a little bit confusing in the textbook. So, for people who do not have the textbook, I put a list of cases in the class already. In that list of cases, there is a website. If you are confused about property ownership, regardless of whether you have the textbook, go look at that website. It lays it out a little bit more cleanly than I think your textbook does, and I'm going to try to do that as well. Now, this is not property distribution law. This is property ownership law. Those are two different things. This part right here is talking about how spouses own property during a marriage, not how spouses dispose of or split property up when they get divorced. It's confusing because we will use the same terminology even though it really doesn't mean the same thing when we talk about later on property distribution. This is just how spouses own property during a marriage. There are two separate ways that this happens in the United States. Those two different ways are common law property ownership and community property ownership. The majority of states follow the common law. Kentucky and Indiana do. The minority, 9 states, and the list is in your textbook, it's also on the website I gave you, are community property states. Now, 9 states sounds like a small number of states, but your textbook tells you that it's a third of the population lives in these 9 states, so it does affect quite a few of us. But most of us are going to be here in the common law section as opposed to community property. So we'll start with community property because it's easier. In a community property state, property that is acquired during the marriage is jointly owned. You don't have to buy it that way. You don't have to put your name on a title that way. You don't need to do anything. And this is relative to ownership of that property within the marriage. So no matter who bought it, earned it, paid for it, inherited it. Inheritance sometimes goes a different way depending on your state law. Indebted yourself, that debt and or property belongs to the both of you. And in most community property states, it's a 50-50 ownership. So one party can have secret credit card debt to the tune of $100,000 and that's jointly owned. Even if the other party didn't know about it, didn't want it to happen. There are some laws in some states that bear on that a little bit, but in a community property state, the ownership is shared. In a common law state, ownership, control of the property that is brought into the marriage, that is acquired during the marriage, is separate. So if I'm married and I buy a car, that car is my car during the pendency of the marriage. Again, this doesn't talk about how we're going to split stuff up when we get divorced. When we get divorced, I'm so optimistic. But that's the common law tradition that the piece of property that you earn, the money you earn, the property that you're given, the things that you buy, the debt that you accrue are yours during the course of the marriage. Now, this can be modified by documentation. So you can still own your marital house with someone, but the documents have to specify that in order for you to have to exert control over that piece of property. It's not that way in a community property state. So you might have seen this in your own lifetime. If your name isn't on the utility bill, even if you're married, the utility company doesn't care. They want the person whose name is on it. And sometimes they might give you information if you say you're married to them, but sometimes they won't, because if your name's not on it, your name's not on it. That is indicative of a common law system. In a community property state, everything is shared. This is also something that people get wrong all the time. And they get it wrong in Indiana and Kentucky, where we are both common law states, where ownership during the course of the marriage is separate, not marital. Now, that is different when we go to separate property, and Indiana has the world's wackiest statute for that, does something no one else does. But the ownership of the property during the marriage is separate. Now, there are consequences to this, specifically credit. So if your credit can be affected, which state is safer? Which state keeps you safer, keeps you separate from someone else's bad credit? Well, it's common law. Which, though, allows you to increase your credit by getting married, community property. Now, that doesn't say that, you can't, that the credit reporting agencies or people who give you credit aren't going to take a marriage into consideration. Of course they will. But in a common law marriage, it's much more separate in terms of credit, in terms of property ownership. And that's what most states do. Okay. Questions on that, you'll have the website I'll give you, and you also have a question discussion board. But that is it for the substantive lecture. Now, we have some cases to go over. I'll go over those in a separate lecture. It may be a couple of days from now. I may end up writing it out. I'm not sure. I'm trying to redo all of my workspace area, so depending on when I can edit, that'll happen. But it's just, it's not that many cases this week. I think it's 5 or 6. And that's it for marriage, how to get married, who can get married, and then what the consequences of marriage are, what it means. And I'll see you next time.